The sound of my husband's laughter echoed down the hospital corridor. I froze mid-step, my body weak from the procedure I had just endured. He wasn't laughing out of nervousness or shared grief, no. This was the laugh of someone enjoying a joke at my expense. The nurse beside me tightened her grip on my arm, steadying me as I wobbled. "You okay?" she asked softly, her kind eyes searching mine. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I'm fine," I lied, though my heart was breaking. I had just lost the baby we had been trying for. And now, only a few hours later, my husband Mark was in the waiting room, entertaining someone with a story I couldn't hear but instinctively knew was about me. As I rounded the corner, his words cut through me like a knife. She was crying like a kid who dropped their ice cream cone. I mean, what did she think? She's not getting any younger. His friend burst into laughter, and Mark smirked, looking pleased with himself. The world tilted, and for a moment I thought I might pass out. The pain in my body was nothing compared to the searing humiliation and betrayal flooding through me. How could the man I married, the man who had once held my hand and promised to love me forever, mock me like this? Mark looked up and noticed me standing there. His smirk vanished, replaced by a look of feigned concern. "Oh, hey babe. Feeling better?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The look in my eyes must have said it all because his friend mumbled an awkward excuse and left. Mark reached for me, but I stepped back. I couldn't let him touch me. Not now. Maybe not ever again. At that moment, something inside me broke, but something else stirred. I wouldn't cry in front of him. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, I straightened my spine, lifted my chin, and said with a calm I didn't feel, "Let's go home." But as I followed him out of the hospital, a single thought burned in my mind: this isn't over. The silence between Mark and me was deafening during the drive home. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw set as if he were bracing for an argument. But I said nothing, staring out of the window, my mind racing. Once we got home, he went straight to his office and shut the door. No apology, no attempt to comfort me. It was as though my pain was an inconvenience to him. I sat on the couch, staring at nothing, the weight of everything sinking in. The miscarriage had been devastating enough. But now, this? His mockery felt like a betrayal I hadn't seen coming. As the days passed, Mark's behavior grew colder and more detached. He worked late more often and barely spoke to me, and when he did, it was clipped and dismissive. It wasn't until I overheard a hushed phone conversation that my suspicions began to take shape. "I can't keep this up much longer," he whispered, his voice low but urgent. "She's starting to notice. We need to move faster." Move faster? My heart pounded as I crept away from his office, careful not to make a sound. What was he talking about? And who was he talking to? I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I started paying closer attention, piecing together the fragments of his behavior. His phone, once left carelessly on the kitchen counter, was now always in his pocket. His laptop was password protected, something he'd never bothered with before. And then there were the bank statements. One evening, while he was in the shower, I logged into our joint account. The balance was far lower than it should have been, and there were several large transfers to an account I didn't recognize. My stomach dropped as I realized the extent of his deception. He was siphoning our money, and hiding it from me, but that wasn't all. A few days later, I found an envelope tucked into the back of his desk drawer. Inside were papers, a deed to a house I'd never seen before, signed in his name and someone else's. A woman's name. Her name was Rachel. The betrayal hit me like a tidal wave, threatening to pull me under. Not only had he mocked me during one of the darkest moments of my life, but he had also been lying to me for months, funneling money into a secret account and preparing to start a life with another woman. I sat in the dim light of our living room, the papers spread out in front of me, tears streaming down my face. How could I have been so blind? I had trusted him, loved him, and now it was all falling apart. But as the initial wave of pain began to subside, another feeling took its place: resolve. I wasn't going to let him destroy me. Not emotionally, not financially, not in any way. If he thought he could walk away unscathed, he was wrong. I didn't want revenge, I wanted justice. And justice, I decided, was something I would get. That night, as Mark slept soundly in our bed, I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling. My emotions were raw, but the clarity that had been eluding me for weeks finally settled in. I couldn't cry anymore, I couldn't let the pain consume me. I needed to act. Quietly, I slipped out of bed and went to the living room, my heart pounding. I spread out the papers I had found and opened my laptop. If I was going to untangle the mess Mark had made, I needed more than gut feelings, I needed hard evidence. The next few nights were a blur of research, planning, and quiet determination. I pored through our financial records, tracking every questionable transaction and logging the details in a spreadsheet. I created a timeline of his deception, cross-referencing it with his work trips and late nights. The more I uncovered, the angrier I became, but that anger fueled me. Mark had underestimated me. He thought I'd crumble under the weight of his betrayal, but instead I was becoming sharper, more focused. By the end of the week, I had enough evidence to confirm everything: the hidden account, the house he bought with Rachel, and even a few emails between them that left no room for doubt. But I wasn't done yet. I reached out to a lawyer, a sharp and seasoned professional who came highly recommended. When I explained my situation, her eyes narrowed with understanding. "If you want to protect yourself financially and legally, we need to move quickly," she said. "He's already shown his hand. Now it's your turn." Her confidence bolstered mine. Over the next several weeks, we worked together to prepare. I moved half of the remaining money from our joint account into a separate one in my name, money I had contributed from my earnings. I quietly documented everything: his erratic behavior, his phone calls, and even the time he spent away from home. At the same time, I started focusing on myself. I contacted a therapist to help me process the emotional toll of the miscarriage and Mark's betrayal. The sessions were hard but transformative. Slowly, I began to see myself not as a victim but as someone reclaiming her power. I also reached out to friends I had grown distant from during my marriage. One night, over wine, I confided in my closest friend, Lydia, about everything that had happened. She listened without judgment, then said something that stuck with me. "You're stronger than you think. He's counting on you to stay quiet and small. Prove him wrong." And I did. Mark didn't notice the change in me at first. He was too busy with his secret life, too confident in his control over me. But little by little, I was taking back control, and soon, he wouldn't know what hit him. The day everything unraveled for Mark started like any other. He left for work, his polished suit and confident smirk intact, blissfully unaware that the foundation of his double life was about to crumble. I had chosen this day carefully. All the pieces were in place, and it was time to execute the plan I had been working on for weeks. First, I met with my lawyer to finalize the divorce papers, which detailed every instance of Mark's financial deceit. The documents were airtight, supported by bank statements, emails, and even receipts he thought he had hidden. The division of assets would work in my favor, thanks to the thorough evidence I had gathered. Next, I took a drive to the house he had purchased with Rachel. I wasn't there to confront her. This wasn't about petty drama. Instead, I delivered a copy of the documents to her doorstep. Included was proof of the funds he had taken from our joint account to finance their little love nest. It was a calculated move. I didn't know Rachel personally, but from what I could gather, she had no idea the extent of Mark's lies. Letting her see the truth for herself would be more impactful than any confrontation could ever be. Then came the final step: exposing Mark's actions at his workplace. Mark prided himself on his career, constantly bragging about how indispensable he was to his company. What he didn't know was that his financial deception hadn't stopped with me. As I dug deeper, I discovered he had been funneling company funds into personal accounts, a trail of breadcrumbs he had foolishly left behind. I sent an anonymous package to his HR department containing all the evidence of his misconduct: the theft, the misuse of company resources, the falsified expense reports. It was all there, laid out in black and white. That afternoon, I received a text from Mark: "We need to talk. Now." I ignored it. By then, I knew he had been summoned to a meeting with his superiors. The fallout had begun. Later that evening, as I sat in my newly rented apartment, a space that felt like mine for the first time in years, Mark showed up unannounced. His face was a mixture of anger and desperation. "You think you can just destroy my life like this?" he shouted, stepping inside uninvited. I stayed calm, sipping my tea as I met his glare. "Destroy your life?" I said evenly. "You did that all on your own, Mark. I just made sure the truth came out." "You've ruined everything," he spat. I set my cup down and stood, meeting him at eye level. "No, Mark. You ruined us when you mocked me, lied to me, and stole from me. You thought I wouldn't notice. You thought I wouldn't fight back. But you were wrong." He stared at me, searching for any trace of the woman he had once controlled. But she was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had taken the pain he caused and turned it into power. "Get out," I said firmly, pointing to the door. "We're done." Mark left, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his defeat. As the days turned into weeks, the fallout of Mark's actions became public knowledge. He lost his job, his reputation, and most importantly, the control he thought he had over me. Meanwhile, I began to rebuild my life. I found a job at a nonprofit I was passionate about, using the skills I had honed during my marriage to help others in need. I surrounded myself with friends who uplifted me, people who reminded me of my worth when I had almost forgotten it. While Mark tried to pick up the pieces of his shattered life, I was thriving, and the best part? I didn't need revenge to win. I simply needed to let the truth speak for itself. It had been a month since Mark had stormed out of my apartment, and his confidence shattered. I had started to feel the weight of his presence lifting from my life, but there was still one loose end I needed to tie up. He called me one evening, his voice laced with anger and desperation. "We need to meet," he said. "You owe me that much after what you've done." I didn't owe him anything, but I agreed. Not for him, this meeting was for me. We met at a coffee shop, a neutral, public place where I could say what needed to be said without fear of his reaction. He was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth. His once perfect appearance was fraying at the edges, his suit wrinkled, his face lined with worry. I walked in with my head held high, a calm confidence settling over me. As I sat down across from him, he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Why?" he demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this to me?" I tilted my head, studying him for a moment. "Do this to you," I repeated. "Mark, everything that's happened to you is a direct result of your actions. I didn't lie, or steal, or humiliate anyone. You did that. All I did was make sure the truth came out." His face twisted with frustration. "You could have talked to me, worked things out like adults instead of what? Letting you walk all over me? Allowing you to mock my pain, steal my money, and build a life with someone else while I stood by quietly." My voice was steady, but the weight of my words made him flinch. "No, Mark. You don't get to rewrite this story. You don't get to play the victim." He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. For the first time, he looked unsure of himself. "You've ruined me," he said quietly. I let out a soft, bitter laugh. "No, Mark. You ruined yourself. You thought I was weak, that I wouldn't fight back. But you were wrong. And now you're facing the consequences of your choices." He looked down at the table, his hands clenched into fists. "You don't understand," he muttered. "No, Mark," I said, my tone soft but firm. "You don't understand. You tried to bury me, but I'm still here, stronger, freer, and more alive than I've ever been. And you're just a man who lost everything because he couldn't value what he had." For a moment, he was silent, his shoulders slumping under the weight of my words. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again, as if realizing there was nothing left to say. I stood, gathering my bag and looking down at him one last time. "Goodbye, Mark. I hope someday you learn from this." As I walked out of the coffee shop, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. I didn't feel triumphant or vengeful, just free. I had spent so much time trapped in the shadow of his betrayal, but now I was finally standing in the light. I didn't need revenge to win. I just needed to be free of him. The weeks after that final meeting with Mark felt like stepping into a new chapter of my life. For the first time in years, I felt unburdened, as if I had finally set down a heavy load I had been carrying for far too long. Mark, as I later learned, had moved in with Rachel, though their bliss was short-lived. She confronted him with the evidence I had left, and according to a mutual acquaintance, she walked out on him within days. His career, his reputation, and his carefully constructed lies had all crumbled, leaving him with nothing but the hollow shell of his ego. But I wasn't dwelling on his downfall. I had too much to look forward to. I threw myself into my new job at the nonprofit, where my work felt meaningful and fulfilling. Each day brought a sense of purpose, a reminder that I was capable of building something worthwhile from the ashes of my past. Therapy became a cornerstone of my healing process. With each session, I let go of the anger and grief, making space for forgiveness, not for Mark, but for myself. I forgave the version of me who had once believed his lies, who had stayed quiet in the face of his cruelty, who had doubted her own strength. My friendships flourished as I reconnected with the people who truly cared about me. Lydia and I became closer than ever, and I found myself laughing more than I had in years. One sunny afternoon, as I sat in my little apartment with the windows open and a cup of tea in hand, I realized something. I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving. I had rebuilt my life on my terms, free from Mark's influence, free from the need to prove anything to anyone. The strength I had found wasn't in tearing him down, it was in rising above, in choosing myself over the pain he had inflicted. Mark's absence had become a distant echo, a reminder of where I had been but not where I was headed. As I looked out the window, watching the world bustle below, I felt a quiet triumph settle in my chest. He had walked away with nothing, but I had walked away with everything that mattered: my freedom, my strength, and my future. And if there was one lesson I had learned through it all, it was this. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about payback. It's about rising above, rebuilding your life, and letting your success speak for itself. I closed my eyes, a smile spreading across my face. The storm had passed, and the horizon ahead was filled with light. I was finally free.